In a regime that created as many monsters as Nazi Germany did, a brigade of sadists stands out from the rest, the executioners serving the sinister desires of Adolf Hitler. Commanded by Oskar Dirlewanger and mostly composed of former convicts, they were responsible for unimaginable cruelties, extortion, torture, mass rapes of women, even girls, and the merciless murder of tens of thousands of people. These were just some of their crimes, committed with absolute brutality, often torturing victims for hours until their final death. Entire villages were wiped off the map by these savage men, with all their inhabitants burned alive for their own pleasure. No act was too sadistic for them. Today, in this new video from military history, we will tell you all about the Dirlewanger Brigade, one of the bloodiest of the entire Second World War.
La unidad de Dirlewanger es repudiada por la Wehrmacht y en gran parte de las SS por ser delincuentes, y sí lo eran. Este es uno de los aspectos más asquerosos del Tercer Reich, y es un fruto lógico de los nazis porque movilizaban gente así.
To start, we should talk about the dark leader of this unit, Oskar Dirlewanger. He was born into a well-to-do family on September 26, 1895, in the city of Würzburg, then part of the German Empire. At 18, he joined the German army as a machine gunner. Although his voluntary service was supposed to last only a year, World War I broke out in 1914, and his division was sent to fight. He participated in the invasion of Belgium and also fought in the fierce battles on French soil. During this conflict, he was wounded 6 times, but always returned to continue participating in the German offensives. By the time his country signed the armistice in 1918, the injuries he had sustained on the front had caused him to lose 40% of the mobility in his left wrist. However, the physical wounds were not the only after-effects. The horrors of war greatly affected Dirlewanger's personality. After the armistice, he was described as having an unstable and violent character, strongly inclined towards drinking. This was demonstrated by his subsequent actions. In the early 1920s, he joined the far-right paramilitary militias, known as the Freikorps. These groups were used by the Weimar Republic, the successor to the German Empire, to fight against communist groups seeking to carry out a revolution in the country. The clashes between the two sides often ended in bloodshed, and it was not uncommon for people to be killed. The Freikorps were violent and brutal against their enemies, proving difficult to control even for the authorities. In one of these confrontations, Dirlewanger was grazed on the head by a bullet, but managed to defeat the communist militia and was celebrated as a hero. During these bloody years, Dirlewanger also pursued academic studies. He was expelled from his first university due to his virulent anti-Semitism, which was not well regarded at the time. But in 1922, he finally earned his doctorate in political science. That same year, he joined the newly formed National Socialist Party, which was quickly gaining followers with its discriminatory ideology. He wasted no time in joining one of its armed wings, the SS, where he would later commit some of his most terrible acts. In 1928, Nazi leaders put him in charge of a textile factory previously controlled by a Jewish family. His criminal tendencies quickly emerged, and he was accused of embezzlement. However, he was not convicted because the stolen money ended up in the coffers of his party, which was already close to seizing power. Nonetheless, perhaps motivated by this initial success, he continued to commit crimes, including illegal possession of firearms and money laundering. All these infractions were forgiven, but in 1934, a year after Hitler came to power, he was accused of raping a 13-year-old girl. The victim was a member of the League of German Girls, the female equivalent of the Hitler Youth, and this time Dirlewanger could not escape conviction. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison and also lost his job, military honors, and his doctorate, and was expelled from the party. However, this fall from grace would not last long. After his imprisonment, thanks to his contacts, primarily the officer Gottlob Berger, he was reinstated into the German SS. Always craving violence, In 1936, he traveled to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War on the side of Francisco Franco's forces, the fascist dictator and ally of Adolf Hitler. He joined the Condor Legion, a unit of German volunteers, where he fought until his side's victory in 1939. Thanks to this service and the maneuvering of his friends within the party, he was readmitted into the Nazi ranks, and his doctorate was even restored. Dirlewanger was back on track for the future, just as the situation in Europe was about to explode. Despite his tense relationship with the National Socialist Party, he always sought ways to advance through the ranks. He turned once again to Berger to speak with Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, in an attempt to convince him to put him in charge of a combat unit. Thus, the 36th Waffen-SS Grenadier Division was formed, although it initially began as a small battalion known as the Dirlewanger Brigade. While its ranks included some soldiers, most of its members were criminals, primarily poachers. It was believed that the tracking and shooting skills these men possessed would be very useful for the missions they were assigned.
The Waffen-SS unit eventually started welcoming the lowest scum of society, from hardcore criminals like rapists and murderers to mental asylum patients and former concentration camp inmates, and the group soon turned into a rampant gang of sadistic brutes with a license to act as they pleased.
After completing their training, they were placed in charge of a forced labor camp in the small Polish town of Stary Dzików. There, Dirlewanger and his men began to carry out the brutalities that would come to characterize them and for which they would become infamous. They frequently made trips to the ghetto in the nearby town of Lublin, where they extorted money from the imprisoned Jews. But this was the least of their crimes. They frequently sexually abused the camp's female population, then burned their genitals with gasoline. Others, after rape, were injected with strychnine, a toxic compound that killed them without exception after excruciating agony. According to sources, Dirlewanger enjoyed sitting and watching as these women convulsed to death, often while smoking a cigarette. But this was not the full extent of his perversions. His victims often included minors, both boys and girls, who also suffered cruel sexual abuse. After the act, they were shot, often by Dirlewanger himself. This was the modus operandi of his battalion. Those affected by their actions were always killed, probably to ensure that there were no witnesses capable of voicing the atrocities committed by this unit, but also as a warning for the rest of the population of the camp and the nearby ghettos to behave docilely. This group was one of those that started dark rumors, which for a long time were believed to be true. They claimed that they cut up the problematic Jews into small pieces and boiled the fat from their flesh to make soap. There is no proof that this happened, but it is believed to have been a tool of the Nazis to terrorize their prisoners. Although these stories were false, the brutality of the Dirlewanger Brigade cannot be denied. The level of cruelty was such that they were investigated by other members of the SS due to excesses of violence and corruption. Although the judge in charge of the evaluation declared that their leader was a terror to the entire camp population, nothing was done about it. The reality was that Himmler and the rest of the Nazis benefited from having men like these, ready to finish off those considered subhuman without a second thought. But Oskar Dirlewanger's violent tendencies did not fall solely on those designated as enemies of the Reich. His own soldiers were frequently punished in atrocious ways for the slightest infraction, real or imagined. Often influenced by alcohol, which he continued to abuse, the unit leader tended to brutally beat his lackeys, even going so far as to kill them. It is said that he could also summarily shoot those he held in low esteem. These excesses, although accepted and even celebrated by the Nazi hierarchy, displeased some German officers. One of them insisted on the removal of the unit from the labor camp. He finally succeeded, and in 1942, the Dirlewanger Brigade was sent to Belarus to fight against the partisans. It was there that their skills as hunters would be useful, at least theoretically, to find where their enemies were hiding. However, most of the actions they carried out were against the civilian population of the region, which often did not even put up any resistance. In general, they used one method to finish off their victims. They would accuse a village of sheltering partisans or saboteurs, and then, even if they did not find any trace of weapons, they would shoot some of the inhabitants to spread panic. The rest were taken to a barn whose doors were closed and locked. Finally, they would set it on fire, with all the people inside. Anyone who escaped was machine-gunned by the Germans. Dirlewanger not only gave the orders, but actively participated, emptying the magazine of his pistol into the victims. It is believed that around 200 villages were wiped out in this way, by this unit alone. They killed around 30,000 Belarusians, the vast majority innocent of what they were accused of.
As with the Einsatzgruppen, which were Nazi mobile death squads operating behind the front line in Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe, Dirlewanger's unit made their victims, often naked, kneel down on the edge of a mass grave, and then shot them in the back of the neck with an automatic pistol. Then the bodies dropped straight into the pit.
Some villagers were spared, but their fates were no better. Several of them were used as human shields, sent to the front of the battalion in minefields to clear the way. The women Dirlewanger favored were kept as his personal harem, which he constantly abused. When he grew bored of one of them, he gave her to his men or simply killed her. Thus, his reign of terror continued for years, leaving entire villages destroyed and fields full of corpses in his wake. His superiors, far from admonishing him, celebrated his actions, even awarding him the German Cross in 1943 for killing 14,000 partisans. As we mentioned earlier, most of them were innocent and had never held a weapon before being eliminated. They had been killed for the sheer joy of their executioners. The Dirlewanger Brigade suffered a temporary setback in 1944 during a massive Red Army offensive known as Operation Bagration. The unit, more accustomed to dealing with civilians, was unable to withstand attacks by professional soldiers and suffered heavy casualties. They had to be withdrawn from the front and rebuilt. SS leaders decided to put the group in charge of what they did best: spreading terror. They were sent to suppress the Warsaw Uprising that took place in August of that year. It was a powerful offensive organized by the Polish resistance that caught the Nazis off guard. While the invaders initially held their ground, they soon regained the upper hand. Dirlewanger and his 4,000 men took advantage of the chaos to commit acts of such cruelty that even other SS members asked to be withdrawn from the front. The brigade's most terrible acts took place in the Wola neighborhood of the Polish capital. In just 2 days, they murdered an estimated 40,000 civilians. Their crimes included setting fire to 3 hospitals, with doctors, nurses, and patients still inside. Many of the women there were previously raped, often by several men before being killed. The Germans had flamethrowers, which they used indiscriminately against the terrified Poles. To the attackers, everyone was an active participant in the uprising and therefore deserved to be killed. Even children were not spared this fate. Dirlewanger's men were reported to have run babies through with bayonets or tossed them into the fire in front of their helpless mothers.
In one appalling incident, Dirlewanger ordered the killing of 500 children in a daycare facility, and in order to save bullets, ordered his men to beat and bayonet the children to death. Just a small part of the 40,000 Poles the unit murdered in a 2-week orgy of terror.
The acts of cruelty of Dirlewanger and his men seemed to increase battle after battle, surpassing unimaginable limits. It is said that the leader of the unit had the macabre habit of hanging people every Thursday. Usually, the victims were Poles, but even some of his subordinates were unlucky enough to meet this fate. Often it was Dirlewanger who kicked the stool where they stood with the noose around their necks. The atrocities they committed in the months of repression were so violent that they managed to alarm Himmler himself. Although he did not remove them, he ordered a division of military police to keep a close watch on them, to prevent them from attacking other German soldiers. But as mentioned before, the Nazi regime saw this behavior as something dignified. which ensured the survival of the Aryan man by eliminating the inferior races. For this reason, Dirlewanger was promoted in rank to Oberführer, considered at that time the first rank of a general. This, however, would be his last promotion. In October 1944, he and his men were transferred to Slovakia to once again suppress popular uprisings. A new scene of their atrocities. Tens of thousands dead, most of them innocent civilians. Thanks to his actions, when the resistance was defeated, Dirlewanger was personally decorated by the winning faction as loyal to Germany. But despite these victories, the Nazis were losing the war. The Allies had them on the retreat and had already invaded German territory. Hitler needed all men capable of fighting to be sent to the front, so the brigade received its final assignment. In February 1945, they were to face Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. As before, they were unable to cope with the highly trained soldiers. Dirlewanger was shot in the chest, putting him out of action. He was taken off the battlefield for treatment. His unit, now without its leader, did not survive for long. The criminals who made up the bulk of their ranks saw no appeal in inter-army combat, so they began to desert en masse. They even went so far as to hang some of their officers who tried to restore order. Of the approximately 4,000 men in the Dirlewanger Brigade, only 700 were left alive when the war ended. In April 1945, with the German defeat already foreseeable, the brutal division leader fled and hid to avoid arrest. However, in June he was recognized by a former concentration camp prisoner and was imprisoned. A few days later, he died mysteriously. The exact reason is not known. The French who captured him claimed it was a heart attack, but other sources say he was captured by a group of Poles, either civilians or soldiers, who beat him to death in revenge for his actions.
According to the testimony of Luftwaffe Lieutenant Anton Fössing, his cellmate and German prisoner of war, Dirlewanger was pulled out of his cell into the corridor every night and brutally beaten by the Polish guards. Fössing later testified, "I have heard blows and terrible screams. In daylight, I would see bleeding open wounds on Dirlewanger's face, and his entire body was covered with bleeding welts."
A conclusion that seems very insignificant compared to the acts that Dirlewanger committed throughout his life. However, there were also rumors that he escaped and joined the French Foreign Legion, but his body was exhumed in the 1960s, and his identity was confirmed. There were no doubts about his death, nor that no tears were likely shed for him. Oskar Dirlewanger was one of the most monstrous men of the Third Reich. He was classified as a sexual pervert, alcoholic, and pedophile, in addition to being a mass murderer. The men in his brigade, following his orders, were directly responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of people, most of them civilians. It was even rumored that they committed acts of necrophilia with the bodies of their victims, although there is no solid evidence for this. Whether true or not, the crimes Dirlewanger committed led to him being seen as a living embodiment of evil and depravity, and irrefutable proof that monsters do exist. We've reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, what surprised you most about the story of Oskar Dirlewanger? Leave your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.